There exists a psychological assumption that most people never question. This is the idea that the self is something internal, stable, continuous, and private. But in clinical psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Gustav Jung, this assumption is treated with caution. Because what we commonly refer to as personality is not a single structure at all. It is instead a collection of socially adapted roles, and Jung gave this system a name. He called it the persona. In Jung's model, the persona is not an illusion or deception. It is a functional interface between the individual and its society. It is the mechanism through which internal states are translated into socially intelligible behavior. In different environments, this system adjusts automatically. In professional context, restraint and predictability are emphasized. In informal context, spontaneity becomes more permissible. In hierarchical context, deference or confidence may be strategically expressed. What appears as personality is often this calibration process in operation. From this perspective, the persona is not who a person is, it is how a person becomes readable to others. Jung does not treat this structure as pathological. On the contrary, it is considered necessary. Without a persona, social interaction would lack stability. It is the basis for role recognition, trust formation, behavioral predictability, institutional functioning. In evolutionary terms, it allows individuals to participate in complex social systems without constantly renegotiating identity from first principles. It is, in that sense, an efficiency mechanism. But like many psychological adaptations, its usefulness depends on degree. Jung's central concern is not the existence of the persona, it is the collapse of distinction between role and identity. When the persona is flexible, it remains a tool. When it becomes rigid, it begins to define the self. At that point, individuals may experience identity not as something they inhabit, but something they must continuously maintain. This introduces a subtle but persistent psychological pressure, the need to remain consistent with one's own social image. Over time, this can reduce behavioral flexibility, not because the individual is incapable of variation, but because variation is experienced as threat. In analytical terms, several patterns may emerge when persona identification becomes strong. First, role-dependent affect regulation. Certain emotions become associated with specific context and are inhabited elsewhere. Second, identity fragmentation across environments. Individuals may report feeling like different people in different social domains. Third, externalized self-evaluation. Self-worth becomes partially dependent on successful role performance rather than internal consistency. These are not moral failures. They are predictable outcomes of a system overextended beyond its adaptive range. Contemporary social environments may intensify these dynamics. Unlike traditional contexts, modern life often requires simultaneous role management across multiple domains: professional, familial, and digital. In digital environments specifically, the persona is no longer intermittent. It becomes continuously observable. Feedback systems such as metrics, visibility, and engagement reinforce stable identity presentation. As a result, the boundary between role and self become increasingly difficult to perceive in real life. The persona is no longer switched on and off, it is maintained. Jung does not propose the elimination of the persona. That would imply disengagement from social reality. Instead, his position is more restrained. Psychological health depends on awareness of the persona as a structure, rather than a unconscious identification with it. In other words, not rejection of roles, but recognition of their constructed nature. This distinction is subtle, but it changes the way identity is experienced, from something fixed to something conditional. The question then is not how to remove the persona, It is whether it is still recognized as a function rather than an essence, because once a role is mistaken for identity, it no longer describes behavior, it begins to define it.